It's time for Gnostic Media Research and Publishing's podcast episode number 198. I'm your host, Jan Irvin. Today, Dave McGowan rejoins the Gnostic Media podcast for part 2 to discuss the CIA and the music of Laurel Canyon, the Magic Carpet Ride. This episode is being released on Tuesday, April 8, 2014, and was recorded April 3, 2014. Dave McGowan was born and raised in the suburbs of Los Angeles, California, where he still resides. After graduating from UCLA in 1983 with an unused degree in psychology, he went to work in construction and now works as a general contractor. He is the proud father of 3 daughters and is a lifelong music fan. And for some background on this episode, General Morrison's father, Admiral Morrison, was the admiral to the USS Bonhomme Richard. And from the website BHR31.com, we see there, quote, in late 1945, the Bonhomme Richard became part of the, quote-unquote, Magic Carpet Mission, in which ships carried troops from Guam and other Far East posts to the United States. She returned to San Francisco in 1945, and after a brief trip to Pearl Harbor, returned to Puget Sound and was inactivated. And then it continues, quote, the USS Bonhomme Richard was inactive as part of the Pacific Reserve Fleet for over 5 years. In 1951, she was activated under the command of Captain Cecil B. Gill, and after a few months of training and a shakedown cruise and repairs, the ship joined Task Force 77 to aid troops in the Wonsan area during the Korean conflict. And then continuing, she was decommissioned in July of 1971, and later, like most ships of this period, sold for scrap metal. As an interesting piece of trivia, lead singer of The Doors, Jim Morrison's father, RADM, then Captain George S. Morrison, served as commanding officer of the ship from November 23, 1963 to November 25, 1964. And then from the UT San Diego, we read there, quote, he took command of the carrier Bonhomme Richard on November 22nd, 1963. His first act as skipper was to announce the assassination of President Kennedy. And Dave's website is davesweb.cnchost.com. That's davesweb.cnchost.com. And Dave's Facebook is also listed up in the notes for this episode, and as well as a link to buy an autographed copy of Dave's book directly from him from his website, as well as the Amazon link is there as well. And there are a number of included references for this episode up on the website, including my first interview with Dave from several months ago, which is 186, and also my interview with Sue Palakis, our Manufacturing the Deadhead article. And the History of FM Radio by Jim Ladd is linked there to a title of it. I'm hoping to get permission to rebroadcast and share that with all of you. And a link to Jim Ladd's book, Radio Waves, Life and Revolution on the FM Dial. And then the Chuck Barris movie, Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. And also information on the dating game killer, Rodney James Alcala. And also linked in the notes is the video Crazy Rulers of the World, and also information on the suspected Craigslist serial killer, Miranda Barber. And then we have information on Rick James torture, etc., and the crash of Michael Hastings related to the Young Turks, as well as Magic Carpet Ride by Steppenwolf. And thanks so much to all of you for making your donations. This episode is brought to you by John, Adam, Imane, Thomas, Zdravko, Patrick, Tommy, and our BTC donation this week is from 1HYVQG. Thank you so much. And we do our best to provide just about everything here for free, but your donations and website purchases are what keep us going. And of course, I ask that you sign up for a membership or a donation, because we can't do it without you. We also accept Bitcoin, Litecoin, Feathercoin, and other donations up on the donation page. Please also check out the store page where you can order our bumper stickers, books, bookmarks, the She Who Remembers archives, a DVD of the Gnostic Media show archives, our t-shirts from Cafe Press, etc. And of course, the views expressed by the authors and guests of this unprogram are their own and are not necessarily those held by myself, the host, or Gnostic Media. Check out the website at www.gnosticmedia.com, GNOSTIC media.com. Reach me through the contact form on the website or at contact@gnosticmedia.com. Thanks for listening, and thank you for your support. Here is my interview with Dave McGowan, Part 2. The CIA and the Music of Laurel Canyon. The Magic Carpet Ride. Enjoy. Hey, Dave.
Hey.
How are you doing?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying I'm doing well. I'm glad to hear from you this week.
I'm doing pretty well. Last night was very weird. It was a trip back to the dark ages. Yeah. Lost everything here, man. Had no powers and no lights, no heat, no TV, no internet, no nothing.
Oh, from the storm or what?
Yeah, it was this weird, like, freak thunder and light. It was very brief. It was like came out of nowhere. It started raining fairly lightly at like 3 o'clock, and then like 15 minutes later, just these massive lightning, and I mean, one of them sounded like it sounded like a bomb had literally gone off on my roof. The whole house shook, the windows, and all the dogs in the neighborhood just went fucking nuts. And, it was just crazy, and yeah, quite a few neighborhoods lost power, and then that was followed by this freakish hailstorm, and then like a half hour later, it was like all cleared up and blue skies and sunshine, and you'd never even know that a storm had passed through. Really bizarre.
Yeah, and we ended up with a half-inch snowstorm up here, and in fact, most of the snow is already melted too. It's a beautiful blue sky day here in the San Bernardino Mountains.
Did you even have a ski season this year at all?
There was a brief one.
We got like nothing. Normally, the mountains around here get snow-capped at least once during the winter, and it's always nice to wake up and see all the surrounding mountains with a snow cap. And it generally doesn't last very long. It burns off, within a couple of days. But at least once during the winter, and usually several times. But this winter, man, I did not see a speck of snow whatsoever the entire winter.
We got snow maybe 4 times this year, which probably the average is maybe 6 or 7. But, the snows were definitely a little smaller, but we got some good rains to make up for it. But, San Gorgonio is definitely snow-capped.
Oh, yeah? Well, that's good.
The biggest one. You're over there probably near Mount Baldy or on the other side of it or something. I
believe so, yeah.
Yeah, I'm on top. What the heck is this one? I'm the one just on the other side of Cajon Pass from you. So I'm the first town on the mountain opposite from you of Cajon Pass.
Usually you can get to the snow here within about 15 minutes if you just head up the Angeles Crest Highway, right up into the mountains, but this year, snow levels did not get too low apparently, because nothing. Didn't see any signs of anything around here. So, well.
Well, we did get a little bit, but certainly not as much as most years. So, how you been, Dave?
I've been okay. It's been kind of a hectic time with the whole book release and pending book release, which I'm still not even 100% sure when the actual release date is.
Some say it's tomorrow. Others say it's the 30th.
Yeah. The Amazon, my publisher, had initially told me that it was April 30th, which is what it's been listed as on Amazon and I think on BarnesandNoble.com. For quite a while now. For a few months, they've been taking pre-orders, listing it at that date. But more recently, my publisher, somebody from the publishing house, had told me that it had been moved up to April 4th, and the Amazon UK site lists it as April 4th, which is tomorrow. But meanwhile, I haven't even received my advanced author copies yet. So, I mean, I'm thinking the retailers better not be getting this thing before I do. You know, it just it doesn't seem quite right. I'm not really comfortable with the idea of something with my name on it that I haven't even seen yet being sold to the public. I mean, I signed off on the manuscript and I signed off on the cover, and assuming that they printed it and bound it correctly, you know, I know exactly what it's going to look like. But still, it would be nice to actually hold it in my hands before it's released to the general public, you know. So
letting a new book go out is frightening because one, it's giving birth. Two, once it's out there, I mean, it's out there, you know.
Yeah. So I don't. All I can say is that it's sometime in April, and that I have been assured that I will get my copies before any retailers do. But that's really all I know at this point. I think it's in the printer's hands and how quickly they can get the print run out, and I have no idea how large a print run they're even doing. And I mean, you know, they're over in London, so communication is not the best. So
right when you're getting up, they're going to bed, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a pain. You know, I'll email them, and it'll arrive there like in the middle of the night, and then they'll get around to answering it the next day, which is the middle of the night for me. You know, and so it's
what I do is, you know, I republished John Allegro's book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, and what I do is send an email, usually in the late evening, and if I send an email at midnight, they're usually, you know, she's usually already working and able to respond right then, you know.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a bit of a chore, and I've really only spoken to them other than email correspondence. I've only spoken to them on a couple of occasions because I don't have an international calling plan, so I can't. You know, they've called me a couple of times and talked on their dime, but for the most part, it's just been very slow email communication. So yeah, it's not the ideal arrangement, but you know, it's just what it is. So.
Are you excited nonetheless to give birth to this project you've been working on forever?
I am excited. I'm nervous. I'm a little anxious. I'm, you know, hoping for the best. And there seems to be some buzz building around it. You know, it has the potential to go somewhere, but I don't know. I have no idea how good, how much marketing and promotion muscle these people have, what kind of distribution network they have, how many actual bookstores it's going to show up in, or whether it's just mainly going to be an online thing, or whether people will to the extent that bookstores even exist anymore.
Right.
How many bookstores will people actually be able to walk in and physically pick up a copy of this book? Because I think it has great shelf appeal. I think they did a fantastic job with the front and back cover, and I think they did a really nice job with capturing the tone of the book and creating a very compelling little blurb to put on the back. And I think if people were actually to see it and be able to pick it up and look at it, I think it would have a lot of shelf appeal. But the question is, how many shelves will it actually get on, and how many shelves even still exist?
Sure.
I mean, how many brick and mortar bookstores are even out there anymore?
Right. Indeed. So what are we allowed to talk about this time that we couldn't cover last time in your interview? There were some chapters and things that you hadn't exposed yet. Are you able to discuss those yet, or what's the story?
Yeah, as far as I know, everything's it's wide open at this point.
Wide open. Great. So let's dive right in then. What didn't we get to cover last time? We covered a pretty wide array when you were here, and we also got into my research on and Joe Atwill's on the Manufacturing the Deadhead article and comparing that together. But so what chapters of yours are new that weren't up on the website, and where do you want to take this show from there?
All right. Yeah. Before I get into that, I got something I wanted to run by you. See what you thought of this.
You're familiar with Pacifica, I presume, right? Pacifica Radio Network.
Oh, sure. I was a longtime supporter for years. I am no longer.
Yeah, they bill themselves as listener supported, and it's supposed theoretically a sort of a branch of the alternative media. One that has completely ignored me for 15 years. I mean, I've been doing this for like 15 years now. I think I put up my first website in 1998, and my first book was published in, I believe, 2000. So I've been, to varying degrees, a known figure, so to speak, in the, alternative media community for like 15 years now, and they have consistently ignored me. They've never shown any interest in any of my books or web series or anything else. Nobody from that organization has ever had the slightest interest in talking to me until like a week and a half ago. And in the last week and a half, I've gotten two separate offers from two different of their people that produce and host radio shows for them, one in New York and one up in like San Francisco, Berkeley.
Sure, KPFA.
Both, KPFA or KPFK or something like that.
Well, KPFK is the one right there in L.A. KPFA is up in Berkeley, up in the Bay Area.
KPFA then, yeah.
And they've got WBAI, I think, in New York or Washington or something.
And they both wanted me to come on and do hour-long shows with them. Just like I say, within the last week and a half, both of them just literally just weeks, if not days, before the release of my book, but neither one of them wanted to actually talk about my book, and both of them, acted as if they'd never even heard of it. And one of them wanted to talk exclusively about the Boston Marathon and last year's Boston Marathon, ordeal. And
Sure.
The other one wanted to talk exclusively about the moon landings. And I'm thinking, isn't that kind of weird that after ignoring me for 15 years, then literally on like the eve of the release of my new book, I get contacted by two people
Sure.
who want to talk about like the most controversial hot button
Well, let me just give you some. Let me give you some background on the Pacifica Foundation and Pacifica Network Radio, and I was a big supporter of theirs for years. And then what really set the alarms off for me was during the Obama campaign, and then after, they just became an Obama mouthpiece, just regurgitating every little bit of whatever he said. But they're really they're more of a communist propaganda front, and they were founded by Lewis Hill, and then Alan Watts, the famous hippie philosopher, was a part of them. And of course, Alan Watts was with Timothy Leary and Gary Schneider and Allen Ginsberg, etc., at the Houseboat Summit Party when they were discussing all of the stuff that we laid out in the Manufacturing the Deadhead article. Alan Watts was a part of that, and Alan Watts was also, as far as I know, he was probably buds. He was in fact friends with Aldous Huxley, and we've shown that Aldous Huxley, of course, was working with MK Ultra, if not the head architect of MK Ultra, as we exposed in my interview with General Stubblebine. And so Alan Watts was there that day when they created the tune on, turn in, drop out thing, which was actually created by Marshall McLuhan. And so Alan Watts is right in the middle of that. Of course, Lewis Hill, the original founder of the Pacifica Foundation, committed suicide shortly after. And then Alan Watts, he got his 20 years of promoting, Eastern philosophy on the radio, and we've exposed that agenda as well. They are literally trying to re-promote the Hindu religion, because the Hindu religion system is based on a caste, with the Brahma up at the top and the peasants down at the bottom. But, what they're doing is they're trying to sell Eastern religions to get people to blindly accept the caste system that they've actually had since the times of the Mahabharata. It's about 6,000 years old. And we can see this same propaganda going out in the work of Jiddu Krishnamurti, etc. So then, we see Alan Watts there. We see that they're promoting the communist agenda, and they're also funded by the Ford Foundation. And let's see here. The Ford Foundation, Kuhn Loeb and Company, which is an interesting connection there, because that's who Gordon Wasson, the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms, that's one of the companies he founded. Ford Foundation was also founded by the OSS. Horace Rowan Gaither, Henry Ford, of course, was behind that. The CIA is also behind that. Reese Committee, Richard Bissell, Robert Maynard Hutchins, and also Wall Street attorneys come in there. Norman Dodd comes up on the side as probably having investigated it. But Ford Foundation is also behind the Aspen Institute, the Bilderberg Group, Congress for Cultural Freedom, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, of course, which that's what ties into Pacifica Foundation. From there, it goes to Margaret Mead, the Marshall Plan, McGeorge Bundy, National Education Television, and then, of course, Pacifica Foundation, Public Broadcasting Service, the RAND Corporation, which I believe you and I talked about last time you were on. You brought up the RAND Corporation. And then we see Tavistock Institute and Timothy F. Geithner. So,
So you're saying that they're not actually listener supported?
Well, I'm saying that they're listener supported, which is irrelevant to the fact that they're a communist, propaganda mouthpiece. And it's not to say that they do put out a lot of valid information too. I've gotten a lot of really good stuff off of their LA station, etc. But when you step back and look at the overarching picture, you can see that they do push an agenda.
Yeah, I know. It seems almost like a preemptive strike of some sort against, like my book's coming out, so they're ignoring my book and doing like everything they can to tie me to like the most extreme sort of hot button issues that I've ever tackled,
Well, get this.
It could all just be a coincidence, I have no idea, but it just seems really weird, the timing after all these years that suddenly two different hosts from two different cities both want to talk to me about two different topics that have nothing to do with my book that's coming out in just
Absolutely.
days,
Well, get this. Several years ago, it was, I guess, 2007 or 2008, I was interviewed by the station, and I drive down there, and, they tell me it's going to be an exclusive interview. It was regarding my book, Astrotheology and Shamanism. And I show up at the radio station, and sitting there in a black barn at the base of the black NBC building is Jordan Maxwell. And then Jordan Maxwell proceeded to attempt to railroad my entire interview the whole time I was there. And just going around the radio station, every single person he saw, I'm the guy behind the Zeitgeist, part 1 film and all of this stuff. And it was a really weird sort of scene. And then, of course, last summer, Jordan Maxwell's own manager came out on Maxwell's website exposing the whole thing. I've similarly had a situation like that happen with KPFK.
Interesting. So anyway, so I just wanted to throw that out there. But so getting back to the book, your question was the new material. The new material in the book, there is a brand new preface, or a brand new foreword rather, written by Nick Bryant, author of the Franklin. What was it? The Franklin. I always confuse his book with the title of his, which is very similar to John DeCamp's. I think his was called The Franklin Scandal, I believe.
Hold on, I'm looking it up right now.
Yeah, I think DeCamp's was the Franklin cover-up, and Nick's was, the preface written by, foreword written by him, a new preface written by me, and then there are new chapters one on Frank Zappa and a couple of his more colorful discoveries, Larry Wildman Fisher and Captain Beefheart. And there's a chapter on Brian Wilson and the rest of the Wilson brothers and the Beach Boys, and a chapter on Arthur Lee and his band Love, and a new chapter on John Kay and his band Steppenwolf, and a new epilogue that talks about the curious connections of the guy known as the dating game killer, Rodney Alcala, his curious connections to the Laurel Canyon scene. And then there's also a few chapters that have been augmented quite a bit. There's been a number of new additions to the Laurel Canyon Death List chapter, and some additional information on the death of Godot Pelikas, I believe is how you pronounce it, which I believe we talked last time about quite a bit about, because you had just recently interviewed Sue,
right?
I guess.
Okay,
yeah,
well, I got to ask you about this. I'm dying to find out what you heard there.
What's that?
About Pelekas.
Well, I've heard numerous different versions of his death. There are several versions that say that he died in a fall at his parents' home/studio. But the accounts are wildly conflicting. Some say that he fell through a skylight. Some say that he fell off a scaffolding. Some say that he fell through an open trap door. So there's like no continuity whatsoever in all these stories of how this kid died, who was very young. He was like 3 years old. And he died conveniently enough on December 23rd, right? Like on or about the winter solstice. Which makes it, rather suspicious.
Right. And that is the time of the death of the son.
And he died under, these very peculiar conditions in which nobody seems to be exactly sure what happened. He was supposedly like either on the roof of this building or on some scaffolding, and he wasn't properly supervised, supposedly, and he fell to his death. But then,
so who puts a 2 or 3 year old on a roof or a scaffolding without supervision?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, exactly. That's. If somebody did that today, I'm pretty sure they would be charged with some kind of criminal offense, child endangerment, or whatever the applicable statute is.
And not able to go out dancing 2 hours later.
Yeah, exactly. But then the plot thickened when it turned out that there was also an additional story that said that he didn't in fact die from the fall, that he actually survived the fall and was then killed in the hospital due to medical malpractice, and that there was a big lawsuit that followed that, in which Vito supposedly sued the city and the hospital and the district attorney's office, because supposedly the district attorney had ordered drug tests to be conducted on the kid, and that's what killed him. And but in digging through that, it turned out that there were actually two different versions of the malpractice story too. The two completely different, conflicting versions of the malpractice.
Did you happen to go through the L.A. City Public Records to see if you could find any of the information on that?
I pulled his death certificate. I was able to obtain his original death certificate, which lists the location of his death, the time of death, and very little else. It's a very curious document, which issued circa 1963, by the way, which is right about the same time as a notorious birth certificate was issued. Obama, the much disputed, wasn't that issued in the early 60s also?
Yeah, but have you considered going into the L.A. court records and seeing what you can find there on the this lawsuit?
I have done searches, and I had a buddy of mine who knows a little bit more about it, do searches, and he said that there was absolutely nothing he could find, that there was no record, no indication of any legal action ever following his death. He said, that's not 100% certainty that it's not there, but he said that, the searches that he could, the methods that he used, the way that he did it, if it was there, it should have come up. So, which kind of casts doubt on that. And also there's the fact that nobody else seems to remember this medical malpractice angle. The two people, apparently Vito himself promoted that, and this filmmaker, Robert Carl Cohen, I believe is his name, the guy that made the Mondo Hollywood.
Sure. That's with the Cohen brothers, isn't it?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't believe so. No.
Okay.
And so, they're the ones that have sort of promoted this medical malpractice. But, it's very curious that of all of the other accounts of it, nobody else on the scene seems to have remembered there being any legal action taken, and there doesn't appear to be any records of it. So the medical malpractice story seems to be a fabrication, although, it's difficult to say. We're, 51 years removed from the event at this point in time. So, but it was, it's just very curious that there are so many conflicting accounts of how this went down, and whether it was actually the fall that killed him, or whether it was procedures that were done on him after he got to the hospital that killed him. There doesn't appear to be enough information available at this point in time to resolve exactly what did happen. But the fact that it occurred when it did, and that there are so many conflicting accounts of how it occurred, and the fact that his parents went out immediately afterwards and went dancing at the clubs as if nothing had happened, and the fact that this kid had a connection, this kid and his parents had connections to Kenneth Anger, the notorious occult filmmaker up in San Francisco, who was a member of one of the founding members of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. And it's also been reported that this kid was actually cast to play the role of Lucifer in Anger's Lucifer Rising film, and the part had to be recast after the kid died, and instead it went to Bobby Beausoleil of the Manson family. So you got all these weird connections in there. Surrounding this kid's death and the date that it happened, and it kind of begins to look like some sort of a ritual sacrifice. If
Right.
You take all of these elements into account, and like I say, it would be all but impossible to positively make that assertion this far removed from the fact. But there seems to be a lot of problems with the death of police, and a lot of irregularities in the birth certificate, like the fact that the authorities were not contacted by the parents; they were contacted by an attorney by the name of Marvin Kahn. And that's a little unusual. If your kid falls through a skylight, I would think most parents would pick up the phone and just call the, emergency services.
Right. You don't
directly.
call your lawyer to call them.
You don't call your attorney and say, "Hey, my kid's laying on the ground, could be dead here, just fell through a skylight, can you contact the proper authority?" I mean, who does that? If they don't have
Absolutely
anything,
no one.
If they have nothing to hide, who would do that?
Right.
What parent would not immediately call for aid for their kid?
Well, I do have Sue Palakis' phone number. Maybe we should give her a call right now and ask her point blank.
I'll leave that in your court if you want. So, yeah, and there's also the fact, now that you mention that, There's also the fact that his mother talked to you for what, an hour or two? An hour?
Yeah.
How long did you?
Well, I talked to her for an hour the day before the interview, and then the interview, and then the day of the interview, she contradicted like half the stuff she said the day before.
And in all that time, she never even mentioned her dearly departed firstborn son.
Right,
and in fact,
exactly.
And in fact, at one point, she talked about moving up north to start a family with Vito, pretending as though she hadn't already started a family with him when she was in L.A.
Right,
I mean, she
exactly.
directly avoided talking about that whole incident, which again tends to suggest that it wasn't what it was billed as. So.
Let me ask you this. Before I had mentioned to you Jim Ladd's The History of FM Radio. Did you ever have a chance to listen to that?
No, I used to listen to Jim Ladd as a kid. I mean, I grew up here in L.A., and he
Right.
was like a fixture on KLOS or KMET
Sure.
or
KLOS.
one of the big flagships. For years, I mean, he was like the main voice of that station for a long. He used to do a Jim Ladd's interview or something like that.
Right.
But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Well, he was at that party that I was at Tim Leary's house in 1993 for the medical marijuana movement, et cetera. And, so after, doing all of my research with Joe on manufacturing the Deadhead and then getting familiar with your research, and I had mentioned to you last time about how, they had to create the FM radio stations to essentially sell the rock movement because the AM or amplitude modulation frequency is only mono. And so then you have frequency modulation. So then they're able to put two signals on one track, left and right, and then you can actually separate the brain hemispheres with the music. But I may be incorrect, but I think that one of the two first FM radio stations was KPFA up in Berkeley, the Pacifica Network radio station. And then, of course, a lot of the Grateful Dead and all of that stuff was first promoted through KPFA.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they were. It's yeah. How long have they been around?
50, 60 years.
Oh wow, that long?
Yeah.
Even before the big '60s, they weren't. I assume that they were kind of born of the '60s counterculture movement, but they were actually around before that.
I think so. I can check it real quick. Pacifica Foundation. I didn't have that in my brain database, but let's see. It was founded by Lewis Hill, as I already mentioned. It was launched in 1949.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so and
yeah,
then,
right after the CIA was formed. That's convenient. Isn't it?
Oh, sure. Well, and then when you look at Jim Ladd's work in that the history of FM radio, and you look at the suiciding of this guy Hill that founded it, and then basically the takeover by Alan Watts and these guys, who we know as a fact, now we're CIA. Then it starts making a very different picture here. See, it says it was founded in 1946 by pacifist Johnny Lewis and Lewis Hill. During World War II, Hill, as well as Lewis, filed for conscientious objector status. After the war, Lewis and Hill and a small group of former objectors created the Pacifica Foundation. And then it goes on from there. But it's pretty odd that conscientious objectors would do so much to promote communism. I mean, the Bolsheviks killed 60 million white Russians when they took over Russia, for instance. So, interesting little problems there in the storyline.
There's always problems in the storyline, isn't there?
Indeed. And they did have a San Francisco station, apparently KPFB, in 1954. I didn't know that they had a KP... Oh, wait. Yes, I guess I did know that there was a KPFB, but it's pretty much a rebroadcast station, I believe.
I would imagine the Berkeley station is kind of their flagship station, isn't it? I mean,
sure, that was the first one, right?
Yeah, and they're probably in like Boston and Seattle and.
Well, they're L.A., Washington D.C., New York City, and Houston.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's it.
Well, they have sister stations that they're rebroadcast with, but oh yeah, those are the main stations there. From 1949, the last station they added was Houston in 1970, which is KPFT, which is KPF Texas. Pacifica Foundation Texas, and then the KPFA was the first one, and then KPFK, which is LA. I don't know what the K stands for on that one.
I've heard that Austin is a big broadcasting center, that a lot of alternative, quote-unquote, alternative media radio stations originate in Austin.
Yeah, that would be interesting to find out more about that, because, Texas is a real huge in the way of freedom and cutting-edge activism and stuff, and it seems like these radio stations were probably put in the center of those key areas, right, where the most activism would happen.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard that Austin and it's kind of a hotbed of CIA activity, and also like the Boulder, Littleton, Aurora, Colorado area, which we just see weirdness coming out of just constantly, pretty much, and it makes sense that it would be, because that's like the main hub of the magazine publishing industry, from what I hear. And if you subscribe to various magazines, you'll see that they oftentimes come from Boulder, Colorado. So anywhere there's like a major, sort of a place that's a main hub for control of information,
and Boulder is
would naturally
Boulder is a tiny little town too. You can drive through it in like a few minutes.
I've never even been to that area. Is Littleton and Aurora? They're little.
Well, Littleton is like right beside Denver, like a few minutes, and then I'm not sure about Aurora, but I don't remember when I was there last. But I drove up to Boulder, went past the Coors Brewery and all of that, and it's a small little town. I mean, it's no bigger than, say, probably 40 to 60,000 people tops.
Really? Well,
yeah.
There's a lot of weirdness that goes on there for a small town, and
it's definitely a hippie mecca.
They're all in very close proximity to the notorious Denver International Airport. That's been the source of all sorts of quote unquote conspiracy theories. So. Yeah, there seem to just be certain little areas of the country, where a lot of weirdness takes place. And LA is one of them, that's for sure. So.
Indeed. Well.
Indeed.
What they do is they find these key centers where they promote their mind control outward from, and so if I suppose if you hit San Francisco and Berkeley and LA and a major center in Texas and then New York and Washington, you're pretty much, have your bases covered, and then you work inward to the center of the country from there, essentially.
Yeah, I suppose. Have we talked about the curious Rodney Alcala Laurel Canyon connections? Because that's a pretty weird set of connections there.
I don't remember that one at all.
That's a new epilogue that I added to my book, which is I emphasized, when it was a web series, I was constantly emphasizing the close parallels between the threads running through the Laurel Canyon story and the threads running through my previous work on organized pedophilia and serial killers in the Program to Kill book. And I came across this Rodney Alcala character who seemed to just like provide sort of the perfect bridge between the two books that really, really hammers away, the extent to which these two stories are actually much more closely connected than you would think they would be. And so I wrote that up as the epilogue to my book, and which is very interesting. You know, to me, it's very fascinating because it's a chapter that could have actually gone into either that could fit equally well into either book. You know, if I had discovered his case earlier, it could very well have ended up as a chapter in the Program to Kill book, but instead, it ended up as the epilogue to this book, which is in part a way for me to cross-promote my books because, you know, somebody's got to do it. But it's a very curious story. You know, I don't know if you're at all familiar with. He's the guy that was dubbed the dating game killer. You know, he appeared on the dating game way back when, and you know, you can pull up YouTube video of it to this day and see this guy. You know, he actually won. He was the winning bachelor. He won the date, and apparently the bachelorette found him to be so creepy backstage that she refused to go on a date with the guy. But yeah, he was presented to America as one of the nation's most you know, eligible, desirable bachelors, and he already had a pretty sordid criminal record by that point. You know, which raises the question: how did they you know, how did the show's people manage to overlook all of that? And then, of course, you know, the dating game was a creation of Chuck Barris, who famously claimed in his book that the whole show that he was a CIA operative,
Absolutely.
a CIA hitman, and that the show was basically a front for, you know, the show was basically an elaborate CIA front that allowed him to travel around the world and conduct his missions, you know.
I just saw a movie that was all about him. Now I'm forgetting what the movie was, but somebody had suggested that we watch it. And I watched it just recently about all of his stuff, but it goes into his whole background and him being an agent and committing all of these murders all over the globe. And what's interesting is that all of his shows sold the same sort of ideas of degenerating society. You know, when you look at all of his shows, they're all of the same dumbed down theme that we exposed in the Manufacturing the Deadhead article.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. So I'll have to see if I can find that film again. Maybe I have it, but I'll find it again and see if I can get that to you.
Yeah, so that one of the curious aspects of his story, the fact that he was cast to go on this dating game, you know, and won. And, you know, had the girl not declined, would have been off with, you know, Chuck Barris off doing whatever it was that they did. So that was a little curious, but it gets much more interesting than that. You know, according to the official story, his first victim was this very young girl. I think she was like 6 or 8 years old or something, by the name of Callie Shapiro, who was abducted in, I believe it was 1969. And she was the daughter of a major record company executive, one of the movers and shakers of the you know, behind the Laurel Canyon scene, because this was 1969. This was at the height of the Laurel Canyon scene, and they happened to be living at the Chateau Marmont Hotel, right at the base of Laurel Canyon, you know, where they would have been mingling with various rock stars, you know, people like Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Graham Parsons, you know, regularly took up residence there in those years. So his first victim was actually the daughter of a record company executive who was allegedly snatched right from the mouth of Laurel Canyon. And one of his last victims, later victims, was a girl who was killed and mutilated and left posed at the northern mouth of Laurel Canyon. In fact, within eyesight of Marlon Brando's home on that's just off the corner of Laurel Canyon and Mulholland, and which was a crime that was originally attributed, by the way, to the Hillside Stranglers, so two completely different serial killers, and then later they claimed that it was actually this Rodney Alcala guy. So that was another one of it. So one of his victims was taken from the southern mouth of Laurel Canyon. Another one was deposited at the northern mouth of Laurel Canyon. A third one of his victims was allegedly this gal by the name of Ellen Jane Hover, who just happened to be the daughter of the founder and owner of Ciro's nightclub, the very nightclub that gave the Byrds their start and that sparked the whole folk rock movement.
Have you found a tie between that club directly and the Palacises?
The which?
Vito and Sue Palakis and the club owner there. Because then you could tighten it even further.
No.
Because the Byrds, practice at Sue and Vito's art studio and then live next door to them.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's not beyond the realm of possibility, but I have not stumbled upon that yet. But this guy, he also, before his murder spree started, in the early mid-60s, he was a student in the UCLA Film School, where he was a student filmmaker at the very same time that Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek were UCLA film students. Right before they formed the Doors. So, they went on to form the Doors. He went on to be a serial killer. Came out of the same, they were there for at least 1 year together.
In the same class.
I mean, the UCLA Film School is a very small, tight-knit community,
Right.
You can't say definitively that they knew each other, but they certainly would have, you would think they would have at least had a passing acquaintance with the guy. And then after that, he moved to New York and enrolled in another film school where one of his instructors was Roman Polanski, of all people, which again ties directly back to the Laurel Canyon scene and the Manson murders and all of the, people connected to that who were prowling around Laurel Canyon. And his first, the very first crime that the first thing, which was the abduction of this little girl and the attempted murder of this little girl from the Chateau Marmont. That crime was investigated by, of all people, Steve Hodel. Do you know who that is?
I do not.
Steve Hodel is a guy he was a former LAPD cop who wrote a book accusing his father, George Hodel, of being the Black Dahlia murderer. He's actually written 2 books now, detailing all the evidence that he says that he's compiled, showing that his father was the Black Dahlia murderer. And in fact, he was considered at the time to be a suspect in the one of the prime suspects in the Black Dahlia murder, never prosecuted. He was, though, prosecuted for raping and impregnating his own daughter, who was, I don't remember what age she was, but, and she testified in open court that he and his friends, which, these very high-powered friends that included people like Walter Houston, film director, and Man Ray, the photographer, would hold these decadent parties where they would pass her around like a sex toy among him and his wealthy friends. And so, you have all these weird sort of threads running through that. And to make it even a little bit weirder, that very same daughter who testified against her own father in court. He was acquitted, by the way, and the media backed him at the time, and just trashed the daughter. But anyway, she later became the surrogate mother to Michelle Phillips. And if you read Michelle Phillips' autobiography, she basically refers to this woman as though she were her mother, because she lost her real mother at a young age, and this gal, Tamar Hodel, sort of stepped in and became her surrogate mother, and it's the one that got her a fake driver's license and got her drinking and introduced her to drugs and all sorts of stuff. And so you have that weird. So everything in this guy's story just ties back to Laurel Canyon. You know, I mean, these places like the Chateau Marmont and Ciro's, and you know, the fact that one of his victims was the daughter of the owner of Ciro's, that another one was snatched from the mouth of the canyon, a third was deposited at the mouth of the canyon, and you have these names like Hodel and Morrison and Polanski and Manzarek, and I mean, it's just phenomenal how many connections this guy had that tied directly back into this scene, into all of the people and places that are mentioned throughout my book. So, so that is now the epilogue to the book, and all new fresh material that was never posted and whatnot. So, yeah, I think it provides a fascinating, chapter to the book, as well as a direct tie-in to, and really hammers home the point that these two books aren't that far removed from one another. Despite
right.
what it means. You think Laurel Canyon music scene, serial killers, not going to be much of a connection there, but there actually is. And I mean, Charlie Manson's fingerprints are all over the Laurel Canyon scene. I mean, he's throughout the book, but what I didn't know until fairly recently is that there was another serial killer whose fingerprints were also, not to the same extent, but quite a bit. So yeah, the whole peace and love scene was a little more bloody and violent than
absolutely
than what we are supposed to believe.
Here's the film that I mentioned a minute ago. It was Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, put out in 2002, directed by George Clooney, and of course based on Chuck Barris's life from The Dating Game. And it stars Drew Barrymore, George Clooney, Julia Roberts, Sam Rockwell, and Rutger Hauer.
Yeah, Sam Rockwell, that's right. Yeah, he played, I think I actually saw it many, many years ago. And that was the film adaptation of his much maligned book, which, most reviewers pretty much scoffed at, that he was just sort of seeking attention or trying to, whatever.
Probably not.
But, yeah, I don't know. It sounds perfectly credible to me.
It sounds credible to me, too. It was originally supposed to star Johnny Depp, and then that failed, and then Clooney took over the film.
Clooney seems to spend a lot of time making movies that purport to, reveal secrets of the CIA or something, doesn't he? Didn't he also do, like, Syriana and, I don't know, several others?
There's been a few. Let's see here.
Quite a few, yeah. He seems to want to masquerade as the anti-CIA crusader or some kind of thing.
Well, the CIA love to pretend that they're anti-CIA.
Yeah,
it's like look over there, look over there, look over there. I'm not the CIA. Look over there.
No, it's not me. It's that guy over there. Yeah,
totally. And they're always doing this stuff. It's just such a common tactic that they use. And once you're in and see how they constantly do this stuff, it becomes pretty obvious. But to begin to recognize it at first, you do need to have some critical thinking skills. But yeah, I mean they love to pretend that It's like working with Gordon Wasson's, digging through his background and flushing him out, and the MK Ultra and regarding magic mushrooms. Whenever anything would get close, they would point to some other guy as being CIA. Well, no, I'm not CIA. That guy over there, he was CIA. And so they would always out they had Dr. James Moore on the crew to Oaxaca, Mexico, when they quote-unquote discovered the magic mushrooms, right? And so when this whole thing comes out, when MK Ultra starts getting exposed, then what they did was, even though the whole team was CIA, they out James Moore as a scapegoat or a red herring to drive people's attention to James Moore and to keep the rest of the story covered up.
Yeah, that's these people have had a lot of time and a lot of I mean, they recruit the best minds they can find.
Well, the best liars. I don't know
years.
about they never recruit people that create things. It's like, they create the best liars, the best agitators, because you don't see them recruiting people that are building sandcastles, but the ones that are really good at going around the beach and knocking them down.
Yeah, it's just they have time-tested strategies that they've used many times in the past, and they know that they work. And I guess they just, it's just the way the world operates. Apparently, I've recently been looking into the Lincoln assassination, and just been astounded at times by how little things actually have changed, and how many parallels there are into that, and to things that are going on right now under our noses. And it's just, you really kind of get the idea that the more things change, the more they stay the same, and the same tactics are deployed, the same. They know what works. They've had a lot of time to refine their techniques and whatnot. And,
Get this, Dave. You know what else George Clooney was in? He was in Men Who Stare at Goats, that, of course, spun General Albert Stubblebine's work upside down. And, of course, I interviewed General Albert Stubblebine. In that interview, we called it Men Who Stare at Scapegoats. And so here he is. You were just saying that he's done all of these films, this sort of thing. I mean, sure, there he is again. The Descendants.
I'd forgotten about that. I actually never saw that one. I was kind of curious about it, but I mean, isn't that a twisted?
It was a whole campaign that they launched basically against General Stubblebine. He started coming out and exposing stuff, and figured out that he had been used, at least from what I could tell. It's really hard to say when you're dealing with the former Commander General of Global Army Intelligence, but it looks like, if the story is true, that they basically outed him and made him look crazy to keep attention off these larger operations with, New Age and, paranormal studies and all of this stuff. So then they out him to keep the operation closed, and then he turns around and outs them because, they threw him under the bus.
Isn't a lot of the parapsychological and remote viewing and whatnot research, hasn't a lot of that just been largely a smokescreen for mind control
Absolutely.
operations?
Well, have you seen the documentary film Crazy Rulers of the World?
I've never even heard of it.
You've got to see that, because it's actually what the Men Who Stare at Goats is based off of. And, this guy went around and did this whole documentary exposing a lot of this stuff, and it goes into Ted Kaczynski, etc. And then he exposes all of this mind control, exposes that Kaczynski was at Harvard and was a victim of the mind control experiments there, which, when you see all of these guys going to SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, etc., and all of the stuff, all of the MK Ultra stuff coming out of the Bay Area, you definitely see a tie between Kaczynski's Harvard stuff and his later bombing targets. I mean, it seems to me that he was pretty pissed that he was a part of the LSD studies and that they had tried to make a fool of him, but he was no idiot. He was a professor of mathematics at Berkeley again.
Yeah, I mean, the Kaczynski story is a fascinating one. It came about actually kind of before my political reawakening. What year was that? And what years was he active in that? I can't even.
Oh, I don't even remember. It was around one of the Olympics or something. Or no, that was that was that. I would have to pull it up now.
But various aspects of it, looking back on it now, seem pretty weird, definitely. And, it has been exposed that he was a, subject of experimentation at Harvard and whatnot. And wasn't it his own brother that supposedly turned him in or something, that recognized his writing style and turned him in, David Kaczynski or something like that?
Yeah.
yeah, that was a little bizarre.
Well, yeah, supposedly the FBI couldn't find him for years, and then his own brother turns him in based on the writing.
Yeah. Have you followed the case that I haven't even heard anything about it recently. Actually, it very briefly surfaced in the news and then was just quickly shuffled out of the news cycle. But this Miranda Barber gal, the Craigslist killer.
No, I don't watch any mainstream media, so I often have to wait for it to come through my channels.
This gal she was arrested and she's facing charges along with her recent husband of killing this guy luring this guy into a trap on Craigslist and killing him because the couple wanted to experience what it would be like to kill someone together or something.
Wow. Yeah, it's here 2 days ago.
But once she got into prison, she started spilling a much more elaborate story and claimed that she was actually an assassin for a satanic cult and that she had killed, she wasn't even sure, she said how many people she had killed.
It says 22 victims here.
Yeah, minimum. She said she lost count. I think she said she lost count at 22, and it could be as many as 100. That she started when she was 13. That she had been forced to, that basically she had been taken by the hand and forced to kill her first victim, and since then had been a very prolific killer for the cult, and just this story, which many of the elements of ring very familiar to people that have delved into that line of research, and she's basically saying sort of the same thing that Henry Lee Lucas said many years ago, that she was a cult assassin. And her father is now calling for her execution. Her own father, who was a military guy. Military intelligence. Pulled up some info on the guy. His past addresses are like, right around where was it? Like McLean, Virginia, or something. And the companies that he's worked for, and it was all very, very, pretty obvious that the guy was a military intelligence type operative based on his employers and his past addresses and stuff, and he's openly calling for the execution of it. He's saying that her story is not true. He's saying that that she's delusional and that her story is not true. Which
but
would
put her
mean
to death
that she's
anyway.
But that she should be executed anyway. Just I guess for the one murder that she did, that he claims that she did commit, and so that whole story is a little odd to say the least. That this girl who happens to come from this military intelligence background and. Has now come forward and is making these wild claims, which of course were reported here and there, not much, and then the story just quickly was shuffled away, and I haven't heard another word about it. But for a while, there were a few little stories that popped up with some very interesting details. One of which was that one of her former home cities and hunting grounds was Wasilla, Alaska. And she was actually a classmate of one of the Palin girls, Bristol, I think, or Willow, or I don't know what is, whichever one, one of the younger ones. It's kind of a small world, isn't it? That she just happened to be a classmate of one of the Palin girls, and
absolutely.
And now she's spinning these wild tales of being a satanic killer, and her own father, who happens to have a military intelligence background, is leading the charge to have her So, definitely a very strange story, which, like I say, surfaced very briefly like a month ago.
It would be interesting, Dave. It would be interesting to try to figure out what her father might be trying to cover up there by asking for, or, promoting her execution.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe that any father would. I mean, you see people all the time accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable, and their families do not the family stick by their side because it's blood, I mean,
right.
Your kids are your kids, and you tend to overlook their transgressions, But so, yeah, for this guy to come out so vocally supporting her execution and yet at the same time claim that, her stories are fabrications, there's got to be something. There's got to be something there.
Indeed. All right. So let's cover some of these other chapters, the newer stuff in your book, if you wouldn't mind. How about Larry Fisher?
Larry Wildman Fisher, very strange guy. He was he had a long history of mental illness. He hadn't even completed school, I don't believe. He spent a lot of his teen years in mental institutions. He at one time attacked his mother with a butcher knife, and I believe at one time attacked his brother as well. And so he spent a lot of time in mental hospitals where he said he was basically treated as a human guinea pig, subjected to all kinds of, potent drug concoctions and electroconvulsive therapy, shock therapy, which was very popular in the 60s. And
not only that, but as Dr. Ross has exposed, very popular form of mind control back then too. Really, actually, just trying to destroy or erase people's brains and then insert a new memory.
Yeah, correct. Isn't that what the guy up in Canada did? Just wiped out their with massive electroshock treatments and tried to wipe their brains clean and completely reprogram it. Ewan Cameron, I think his name was.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So this guy had gone through that, for much of his early life, and then his family had basically disowned him. He was living on the streets as a street singer, singing for pocket change. He made up these crazy, the guy had no discernible talent as a songwriter or singer or anything else. But Frank Zappa nevertheless signed him to a contract and put out a couple records by him, and which are still, I assume, available. Whether or not it could actually be considered music, I have no idea, but he was certainly one of the strangest and most colorful characters on the scene. And then he had a falling out with Zappa and basically went back to being a street person. And then he had a minor resurgence with working with Billy Mummy, the kid that was on the Lost in Space series, I think it was. And then later had a novelty band called Barnes and Barnes that did these novelty songs that were played on the Dr. Demento show and whatnot. And he recorded a couple more albums with Fisher, and then they had a falling out when Fisher accused Mummy of being involved in some type of a conspiracy with Dr. Demento and Weird Al Yankovic, believe it or not. And I think he ended up back in a mental institution and basically died in some assisted care facility, with, pretty much unknown, back to being just, basically a street person. And so basically he was exploited for varying periods of his time by varying people to, sort of craft him into a singer-songwriter, and which he was never, really qualified to be. So yeah, he was just sort of a peripheral and very strange character in the story who, had been from a very early age subjected to all kinds of what could probably best be described as psychiatric torture techniques, and paid a price for it throughout his life.
All right. How about Captain Beefheart?
Captain Beefheart's an interesting guy. John Kay's an even more interesting guy. The leader of Steppenwolf. Was that a band you were ever into back in the day?
Maybe a little bit. I'm younger than you are, so I mean, obviously you can't turn on the radio without their 50 years of mind control booming into your ears anymore, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really turn on a classic rock station without hearing Born to Be Wild or Magic Carpet Ride. I mean,
Right.
those were pretty much their two big monster hits.
And we had, I think, concluded the last episode with Magic Carpet Ride or something like that. If we didn't on that one, we will on this one. So there you go.
Oh, did we talk about him before? Or?
No, but I had played, you know what it was that we played? Do You Believe in Magic? And then Secret Agent Man was what we concluded with last time. But, it's like that whole magic theme, getting people to appeal to magic and not look at the facts. That's what they're always selling. That's how the mind control works. It's, all of this paranormal stuff and everything. You get the person who's coming at it from the outside to think that it's paranormal and, telepathy and all of this stuff, when the predator behind it all uses these as tools to trick the victim in to the system of control.
Huh. Interesting. Probably the most interesting thing about John Kay is that he provides a bit of a Nazi connection to Laurel Canyon, which is always good. Because he was actually born in Nazi Germany during World War II as the son of a Nazi officer. And as was his wife. His wife was actually also the son of a Nazi officer, and so was one of his bandmates. And all three of them in the 50s, in the post-war years after the war, they made their way to Toronto and became a part of a music scene that was going on there, and they formed a band known as the Sparrow. And there was another band at the time known as the Mina Birds, which was led by a guy by the name of Ricky James Matthews, I think it was, that he called himself back then, who later became Rick James, the notorious Funkmeister and torturer, who actually went to prison, didn't he, for torturing some girl with cigarettes and whatnot?
Are you talking about Rick James, the musician?
Yeah, Rick James.
Like Rick James,
Freak.
bitch, that musician?
Yeah,
okay.
Rick James.
Okay.
Yeah, he was the leader of the Mina Birds, and John Kay headed up this other band, the Sparrow, which was kind of one of the other big bands at the time in Toronto. And Rick James' band actually featured both Neil Young and Bruce Palmer. And John Kay's band had several other people. Goldie McJohn and Nick St. Nicholas and I don't know, a couple other people. But anyway, at some point, basically all of these people, except for Rick James, who got thrown in the brig for draft evasion or something, or desertion or something like that. But all the rest of them made their way to Laurel Canyon, where they all formed up these various bands. Some of them became Steppenwolf, some of them became Buffalo Springfield, and some of them became I can't remember the other one. But three of the bands basically were the remnants of this scene in Toronto, just sort of transplanted themselves at the same time that everybody else was headed into Laurel Canyon, and formed up three of the key bands that really shaped that scene. So
Dave,
some of the talent in Laurel Canyon came directly from Nazi Germany by way of Toronto, Canada, strangely enough.
Interesting. Have you looked into the connections with Zionism and all of this stuff? Since you've looked at Germany, in our work on MK Ultra, we see ties going directly into Zionism, repeatedly.
No, not really. Not to any large extent. Not at this point, no.
Yeah, I mean, if you pay attention to a lot of the last names, it makes it startlingly clear. It's like the guys who put on the big festival in New York. I can't even think of it now. It slipped my mind right when I brought it up. But when you start looking into the backgrounds, a lot of these people, there are definitely a lot of Judaic Zionist connections as well. Maybe, like you mentioned, you and Cameron and these guys earlier. I would say maybe even 70% of the names I've pulled up in MK Ultra happen to be of that particular background.
Huh. Yeah, I haven't really delved into that angle as of yet. So
always more interesting stuff. All right, so what about?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's always plenty more rocks to look under. I mean, there's unfortunately only so many hours in the day, and there's just there's so many things that catch my interest, so many things that go by that I really would love to look into. And I mean, like Sandy Hook was one of the big passing stories that I just kind of slipped by me, and I really wish I had the time when that was going on to dig into it, because what I've learned since then is pretty compelling. But unfortunately, like I say, there's only so many hours in the day, so I do what I can.
Well,
but,
you and I have been talking for a year about meeting up one of these days, and you're just down the road, so we should actually sit down and pull out, I'll bring my research stuff with me and sit down one day and review notes and see what shows up. It'd probably be beneficial for both of us.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. So, Captain Beefheart, did you want to go over him a little bit? Or?
Sure, him, and then jump into the Beach Boys.
Yeah, Beefheart was an interesting guy. His real name was Don Vliet, or Don Von Vliet. I'm not sure which. He used both. And he had been a high school friend of Frank Zappa. Zappa, of course, was a product of the military intelligence community. Also,
Zappa was at the Edgewood Center?
Born and raised at Edgewood Arsenal. The first 7 years of his life, he lived actually on the base in on campus housing. And his father was assigned to the Edgewood Arsenal as a chemical warfare researcher. And after that, they made their way out to Lancaster, California, which, of course, is right alongside Edwards Air Force Base and all kinds of other weird goings-on. And apparently, most likely worked out of that facility for a while. And it was at that time that Zappa met Captain Beefheart, who was probably also of military intelligence, family background. And the two of them, some of Zappa's earliest work was with Beefheart when they were still in high school. They did some experimental stuff and whatnot. And then later, when Zappa, hit it big and started up his own record labels and started signing up people like Alice Cooper and Larry Wildman Fisher and whatnot, Captain Beefheart was one of his stable of artists. And they had one very big album called Trout Mouse Replica, which some people to this day consider, it regularly shows up on, like with Rolling Stone does a list of like the 100 greatest rock albums of all time. It will generally show up there, or Billboard or whatever. It's, considered by critics to be, one of the classic albums of the era, but it's definitely an acquired taste, much, not to the extent that Wildman Fisher, was a little eclectic, but Captain Beefheart's definitely an acquired taste. It's didn't really fit in all that well with the other kind of music that was going on in those days. But the most interesting thing about him is the way that he created that album, and which was by basically behaving in a very Manson-esque fashion. In fact, he was directly compared to Manson by some of his band members. And basically, he rented a house in Canoga Park or something, some little nondescript 2-bedroom house, blacked out all the windows in the place, and basically imprisoned his band in this house for months, where they had to work like 18 hours a day. They were rarely fed. They didn't, they were sleep deprived and food deprived and physically tortured at times. According to the various band members, said they were actually beaten at times. And apparently none of them were ever paid or never received any substantial payment for their work. None of them received credit. Beefheart basically took sole credit as composer and arranger of all the music, even though it was actually a collaborative affair, and took all the royalties, took all, everything. And these guys basically were imprisoned and tortured for like months to create this album. They weren't allowed to they were forced to stay in this blackened tiny little house, and in very, very Manson-esque type of conditions, and that was his modus operandi for not just that album, but a couple albums that followed that, and he just had this incredible level of control over his band, to be able to do that. So you got to ask yourself why did these people go along with that? Why did these people allow themselves to be imprisoned and abused and underpaid and everything else for the benefit of this guy? And so it was a very unusual situation, that very closely paralleled the real Manson family that was operating right in the same area at the same time. So you had and Zappa actually he kind of had his own little cult following as well. And, like Manson, he gave all of his followers nicknames. They were all depersonalized and given nicknames and, stripped of their former identities and whatnot. And, so, you had all these people who were, behaving as sort of cult leaders, with their followings. And, so it was a very weird parallel there between the Beefheart, the Beefheart's method of album creation and these other cult type leaders with their followings. So that's basically, that's the gist of the Beefheart story. There's more to it in the book, but that's some of the more interesting highlights of the Captain Beefheart story.
What about the Beach Boys?
The Beach Boys. The Beach Boys were, those guys had to be mind controlled, didn't they? The Beach Boys are a very strange story. Their father was a brutal, rigid disciplinarian. Dennis Wilson in particular would tell stories in later years of just these brutal beatings by his dad that were so bad at times that, according to some accounts, the father is the reason that Brian Wilson was deaf in one ear throughout his adult life, because his father smacked him upside the head with like a 2x4 when he was just a little kid. And so Brian Wilson was actually deaf in one ear throughout his adult life. He could not hear in stereo, strangely enough, although he was regarded as possibly the finest composer and arranger of the era. He was unable to hear in stereo because of his father's abuse. So these kids grew up in a very, very abusive environment and became stars at very, very young age. When the Beach Boys put out their first album, Brian was barely an adult. I think he was only like 18 or 19, and Carl and Dennis were like 15 and 16 or something like that, very, very young, and completely under the control of their father, who set up their music publishing company and took complete control of it, controlled all of Brian's, song rights and royalties and whatnot, and just, had a very iron-fisted control over them. And of course, Brian is no big secret that Brian is a very deeply, deeply troubled individual and still is to this day. And, there's all kinds of stories about him sort of having these like fugue states, he would just like disappear at times, which is why they had a series of minders. Basically, they had a constant series of minders who were sort of paid babysitter / bodyguard handlers for him. You know, there was always somebody lurking in the background who was sort of Brian's handler. Some very curious figures, Dr. Eugene Landy being the most notorious one. And but Brian would sometimes just like disappear, and then he would reappear somewhere else without having any idea of how or why he got there. One time he disappeared, and the whole family was like frantically searching for him. Had no idea where he was, and he was found in a gay bar down in San Diego playing songs on the piano for drinks, and he had no idea who he was or why he was there. So he would have these, what the psychiatric community calls fugue states, which are like temporary amnesia states where you just sort of check out for a while, and then when you come back and you have no idea where you've been for the last 3 days or why you're at where you're at, or, you know, what you're doing or anything, and which is very closely tied to the phenomenon of mind control, which is, it's based on, the deliberate creation of dissociative identity disorders, which include like amnesia and fugue states and multiple personality disorder. And, it's the deliberate creation of alter egos that take over, your mental functions or whatever. And it very much appears that Brian has been plagued by that throughout his life, where sort of another personality, another, version of himself will just take over for a while, and, and then he'll turn up several days later without having any clue where he's been or why. And then, of course, Dennis Wilson was famously very close to the Manson family. He's the guy that actually invited them into his home in the summer of '68 and allowed Charlie and Tex Watson and a number of his girls to spend the entire summer with him, and foot the bill for putting the roof over their head and food on their table, paid all their medical bills, allowed him to drive around in his Ferraris and Lamborghinis and whatnot, and basically just provided financial backing for he and his family for the entire summer of '68, the summer before the notorious killings in the summer of '69. That's a little hard for some people to reconcile with the squeaky clean Beach Boy image, that Dennis Wilson was so closely tied to, and actively tried to get him a recording contract, and he would take him over to Brian's home studio and record demo tapes and whatnot, and, very much a promoter of and fan of Charlie Manson for that summer. And then he, of course, turned up dead in, circumstances that many people still question, drowned in his own boat slip down in Marina del Rey. And so, that was another little interesting aspect of the Beach Boys story. And I don't know, I'm sure there's more in there, but if I dug through the chapter, I could tell you some other various tidbits. A couple of his, one of his handler, or one of his closest collaborators was this guy named Tandon Almer, I think it was his name, who before Brian Wilson, his biggest claim to fame was that he had written the song Along Comes Mary for the band The Association, which was yet another Laurel Canyon band, a song that I'm sure most of your listeners are probably be readily familiar with. And he was also famous apparently for inventing some kind of a bong, some kind of a water pipe back in the 60s. from what I hear. But anyway, and he then became one of Brian Wilson's collaborators, wrote songs with him and whatnot for some of the albums, and then the guy, and he was widely viewed as sort of a rising star on the Laurel Canyon music scene. He was one of the guys that was, kind of expected to be this big breakout star. And it never really happened. And after his collaboration with Brian Wilson, he just literally disappeared off the face of the earth. And for decades, nobody really seemed to know what had happened to the guy. He'd been part of the scene one minute, and then he was just gone. And it was, widely believed that he had probably died at some point. And but it turned out I think it was just last year, he actually did die, and at that time it was discovered that for decades he had been living in a basement apartment in McLean, Virginia. I mean, literally in the CIA's backyard. And so, yeah, for some reason, this guy who had been a big part of the Laurel Canyon music scene and one of Brian Wilson's main collaborators just decided to go off and spend the last, 30, 40 years of his life living in anonymity in the CIA's backyard. So that's a little curious, and then one of his other handlers was this guy Eugene Landy, who was, widely alleged to be an MK Ultra programmer, basically, who also worked with Alice Cooper and was reportedly the doctor who was treating actor Gig Young when he and his, I don't know if it was his fiance or his wife, turned up dead in a New York apartment. And it was written off as a murder-suicide or something, and he was connected to that as well. So Brian Wilson had a lot of sort of shadowy characters who were lurking in the background throughout his career. There seemed to be at least one of them at all times. What appeared to be handlers of sorts who were sort of lurking in the background of his career. And then, of course, his career just completely derailed in the late 60s with the Smile album, which didn't end up getting released until fairly recently, actually. It was the great unheard album for decades, the one that was supposed to be the big follow-up to Pet Sounds, that really put them over the top with Good Vibrations and all that, and then his follow-up to that was supposed to be Smile, which was supposed to be this just revolutionary music, and it was supposed to just sort of revolutionize the music world, and everybody expected really big things from it, and then it just sort of Brian just kind of whatever happened, and the thing ended up getting shelved for just decades, and the Beach Boys story is it's very curious one. I was never a huge fan of them. My brother was when I was growing up, so I used to hear their music playing a lot in the background, and I just tended to dismiss it as sort of bubblegum pop, But Brian Wilson is actually regarded by a lot of people as being just this hugely talented and influential, singer, songwriter, musician, composer, just a supremely talented guy, but a very, very deeply troubled guy, and a guy that came from a tremendously abusive childhood. And all of the elements, and a guy who suffers from an apparent dissociative, identity disorder. So, all of the elements are there for him being, pretty much of a, mind control victim. But I don't think that really makes him all that unique in the music world or in Hollywood in general. So, it's,
right. Unfortunately.
It's just a little more obvious in his case than it is in a lot of other cases, given his behavior and the handlers in the background and the abusive childhood and all of the different elements, it kind of all sort of points in that direction. But like I say, I don't find that to be at all unique or unusual.
All right. Would you prefer to talk about the Young Turks or Arthur Lee, or let's see, who is this other one that I wanted to possibly touch on today? It was if I can find it here. Anyway, why don't we hit Arthur Lee or the other one I just mentioned there?
The Young Turks?
Yeah.
We could hit that. Yeah, the Young Turks were they were also very much a part of the Laurel Canyon scene, very closely tied to the musicians. They were basically a group of young actors and actresses, sort of on the vanguard of Hollywood. People like Warren Beatty and Jack Nicholson and Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper and all the people that were sort of in that social circle. Peter and Jane Fonda and Sharon Tate were all sort of the Young Turks and Turkettes, and who were very much a part of the Laurel Canyon scene. A lot of them lived right there in the canyon. Peter Fonda did for a while, and in fact, a lot of people I'm sure don't know this, but Peter Fonda actually at one time was so caught up in considered himself so much a part of the scene that he actually recorded his own solo folk rock album, which probably mercifully was never released, but he actually recorded a whole original album. And there was a lot of the movies that these people were in were closely tied to Laurel Canyon, like the movie The Trip was actually filmed in a house in Laurel Canyon, a house that was later occupied by the band Love, and Easy Rider had deep ties to Laurel Canyon. Parts of it were filmed there, and the two main characters were based on Laurel Canyon's own. David Crosby, the character played by Dennis Hopper was basically based on David Crosby, and the other guy was either Roger McGuinn or one of the other guys, depending on who's telling the story. But both of the characters are basically said to be derived from that scene, and these guys were all very, they all hung out together. They all, the musicians.
Dave, let me ask
you,
why do you think they chose the name the Young Turks? Because weren't the Young Turks the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide? So why would this group of mind controllers want to adopt the name of people that committed mass genocide?
That's a good question. I didn't know that was the origin of the name. Isn't there a group of journalists, news people now, guys?
Sure, yeah. That I think.
In fact, wasn't that guy that crashed into the tree here in L.A. last year? Wasn't he a member of the Young Turks news team?
Yeah, that may be there. I know on YouTube there's a guy that calls himself the Young Turks that does a little news show or whatever. But yeah, I mean that's based. The origin of that is this group of people that committed the Armenian genocide that you hear so little about.
I did not know that. That does make it a little odd that people would want to readily adopt that name. But anyway, unless
they're trying to secretly promote genocide on another society and using all of this mind control and this stuff to lead the people that way. So then you have actually a parallel of these ideas there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually did not know the origin of that name. That is interesting. But anyway, the thing with the Turks, the most fascinating thing that I discovered in looking at them, and I think we've already discussed for the most part, how many of the key Laurel Canyon musicians, seem to come directly from military intelligence circles. Jim Morrison being the son of Navy admiral, and Frank Zappa being the son of a chemical warfare engineer, and all three of the guys from America being sons of U.S. Air Force intelligence officers, and Jackson Browne being born on a military base in occupied Germany, and on and on and on. There's just so many of these people who come from military intelligence families. And what I found was that the very same thing applied to all or most of the young Turks who were very closely tied to these musicians. Dennis Hopper, before his death, which was fairly recently, within the last couple of years, he came out and acknowledged that his dad had been a career intelligence operative who started out with the OSS, before it was even the CIA, and then, continued doing intelligence work, the official biographies say that he was like a farmer and a postal worker or something like that. But Dennis Hopper himself has said, no, my dad was an intelligence operative. And, Sharon Tate, of course, was the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tate of, I think it's U.S. Army Intelligence or U.S. Air Force Intelligence. And who else? Oh, Bruce Dern was another one of them, and his uncle was like some very high-ranking Skull and Bones man, and his like godparents were the First Lady of Eleanor Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson, I think, the Democratic presidential candidate or something like that. So he has very deep political roots in his family, and I'm forgetting all the other ones, but I mean, basically, as I went through this list of people, it was the very same thing. You see all of these people coming out of the same sort of family background of, high-ranking military officers and intelligence personnel.
Right.
To a staggering degree. I mean, it's almost hard to find one who doesn't have some kind of direct connections, and even where it appears that they don't, as in the case of Dennis Hopper, it turns out that they actually did. So you can't always tell by looking at these people's biographies, what they really were, but the writing's on the wall in a lot of cases. And Warren Beatty, his dad appears to have been a CIA psychiatrist, for lack of a better word. His dad was a fairly prominent psychiatrist and who bounced all around the Washington, D.C. area throughout, Warren, his upbringing. And, just constantly seemed to find himself alongside, prominent military facilities and whatnot. So, there's a pretty good chance that he wasn't just your routine psychiatrist, but, you can't definitively say that. But on a lot of them, you can, I mean, like Dennis Hopper has said that, my dad was OSS, and Sharon Tate's dad was absolutely an Air Force officer, career. And, on and on down the list, and it's absolutely mind-boggling how many of these people who were, key shapers of public opinion in the counterculture in those days came directly from military intelligence families.
Indeed. And, I don't know if you had a chance to read my article, Manufacturing the Deadhead, when we put that out, but we talk in that article about Edward Bernays and him bragging about how they would intentionally create pop stars. And if I can... so Bernays, and this is under Music Idols number 3 in the Manufacturing the Deadhead article. Bernays says, quote, "Human beings need to have Godhead symbols, and public relations councils must help to create them." And then he goes on, "We have no being in the air to watch over us. We must watch over ourselves, and that is where public relations counselors can prove their effectiveness, by making the public believe that human gods are watching over us for our own benefit." And also, Bernays manufactured the public's adoration of Enrico Caruso, who is called the first American pop star. And he says, quote, "The overwhelming majority of the American people who reacted so spontaneously to Caruso had never heard of him before." And then the next quote, "The public's ability to create its own heroes from wisps of impressions and its own imagination, and to build them almost into flesh and blood gods fascinated me. Of course, I knew that the ancient Greeks and other early civilized peoples had done this, but now it was happening before my eyes in contemporary America. And of course, he is actually creating it. And then, it's essentially based off of peacocking, and you get, like in a monkey tribe, you get the alpha male, etc. But what they do is, puffed up peacocking, and then, put these people in the media, and then everybody else chases after them. Oh, look at the stars. Ooh. And this sort of thing. So, we can see this whole pattern here. And then actually to just a couple of lines down here, we cite you. The research of David McGowan has shown that the connections between military intelligence and the music idols that promoted drug use to America's youth were too numerous to have been accidental. Among the many examples, Frank Zappa was the son of a specialist in chemical warfare. Jim Morrison's father was Admiral Morrison, the same Admiral Morrison who oversaw the false flag Gulf of Tonkin incident that launched the Vietnam War, etc. But we can see that the entire thing is intentional public relations to keep people distracted with these false idols that the intelligence community sets up to, steer the people around. And now, Miley Cyrus and this nonsense being the latest creation of the mind control.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, they do very much appear to be manufactured, and it wasn't as obvious in the '60s as it is now. I mean, nowadays these people just come out of they just come down the pike like prepackaged with an image and a sound, and the Lady Gagas and the Miley Cyruses and the whoever else is out there, Beyonce's and whatnot. But even then, I mean, you look at someone like Jim Morrison, and you look at there's a picture in the book, in my book, of him from just a year before he emerged on the scene, where he's pictured on the deck of his father's ship, and you would never think that this guy in just a year would emerge as this iconic rock god. I mean, what you see is this very clean-cut, collegiate, conservative-looking kid, and then just a year later, there he is on the strip with the flowing locks and the leather fringe jackets and whatever, and this whole sort of image and sound I mean, it sort of become this larger than life character, literally like overnight. And yeah, it's astounding, to see the transformation that he went through. And what was that something that he himself felt the inspiration to do? I mean, he just decided to adopt that look, and it just has a very manufactured quality to it. And you look at the background of how these bands got together, and how quickly they were thrown together and provided with instruments and recording time and signed to contracts and all that, just like out of nowhere. I mean, these were like kids, just unknown kids that just flocked into Laurel Canyon from various parts of the country for no apparent reason, and next thing you know, they have all new instruments, and they have recording contracts, and they have studio time, and they have club dates, and I mean, within
60 years of their music being repeated nonstop on the radio as well.
I know, yeah, it's to this day. So yeah, it had a very, the more you look at it, the more it had a very, very manufactured quality to it, which, wasn't perceived at the time. All these people were elevated to the status of like gods practically. Sure.
And just like I just quoted right now, that was the actual intention is to make them into gods.
And these were not just singers, songwriters, and actors. They were not just entertainers. These were people who were promoted to such prominence that they basically became the spokesmen and the de facto leaders of the generation of the whole sort of resistance movement, and were they were positioned to be in that, in that sort of a position where they could have enormous influence on public opinion. And I'm pretty well convinced these days that no one that's in a position to have significant influence on public opinion is probably legitimate.
Right.
I just I'm very skeptical these days. I don't think you get a soapbox unless you're part of the inner circle.
Sure.
I just don't think it happens. You know, you and I can talk on some obscure, you know, internet podcast or whatever, but you know,
exactly. You don't see me getting offers from NBC for $4 million for my podcast here, you know.
Not anytime soon, no. My phone is starting to beep at me, by the way, which I think means that the battery is fading.
Yeah, exactly. So I was just about to wrap it up here, too, for our second show. And, Dave, you and I really should get together sometime soon and sit down and look at all of this research that you and I have pulled together. But what is the single most important takeaway point that you would like people to have from this second interview?
Don't buy my book from Amazon. From me directly.
Selfless promotion, ladies and gentlemen.
Somebody's got to do it. What can I say? Yeah. So, yes, I am offering both the new one, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, and my previous one, Programmed to Kill, which you know, as I've said, have very similar themes running through them. I'm offering both of them for sale on my website for what I think is a pretty fair price. A little bit more. I can't quite compete with Amazon, but Amazon doesn't have signed copies, and I do. So if anybody that doesn't want to support Amazon and is willing to just spend a couple dollars more, I would greatly appreciate it if you come to my website and buy them directly from me. It benefits me much more, and you get a signed copy out of the deal, and hopefully everybody's happy.
And not only that, but signed copies maintain their value and go up, whereas the normal copies usually don't. So there you go.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think a lot of people are holding out for the ebook. You know, it's unfortunately the way the publishing industry is going, which I have very mixed feelings about. I mean, I get royalties off them just like I do the real books, but I just bought. You know, I'm not a fan of the Kindle experience. I'm a guy that still likes to hold a physical copy of a book in my hands, but I understand that times are tough and, you know, people have to make decisions based on their financial situation. So, you know, if that's the way you got to go, then that's the way you got to go. But if you would like a signed copy, they are available. So that's my pitch for that.
There you go. And that's the same case with me, too. My own moment for some selfless self-promotion here is, you know, if you buy it from my website, I do autograph them before they go out rather than from Amazon. And, of course, it helps us a little bit more as well. So we're in the same boat as you are. And
Amazon is brutal. Amazon is not a real popular entity with either publishers or writers, you know. I mean, they're like Walmart and Costco, you know. They have so much power, so much muscle nowadays that they can basically force vendors to provide them with product at deeply discounted rates, you know, because it's either you play by our rules or you get left by the wayside, you know. And so, you know, they basically force the publishers to provide them with books at cut rate prices, and, you know, it affects the publishers' net profit on the books, which in turn affects my royalties on the books. So, you know, Amazon does what they do for Amazon's benefit, not for the authors or the publishers' benefit. So,
indeed.
But, you know, I mean, some people, you know, a lot of people are going to buy it from them anyway because they have great prices and they have the ebook. So, you know, whatever works for you. But you know, I would highly recommend you getting a copy of the book, everyone out there, of course, because it's my book. So. But I think it really is a very, I put a lot of work into this thing. I'm very proud of it, and I think it's a very compelling story, and so we'll see how it does.
Well, congratulations, Dave, for all the hard work, and we appreciate it. And your research has been very valuable for our own in uncovering all of these CIA and intelligence operations against the American people. And it's clear to us that MK Ultra et al. Is still fully active today and has not But anyway, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon and possibly getting together where we can sit down and cover everything.
All right, yeah, definitely. And what in the world's going on at Fort Hood, by the way? Wouldn't you think that a military base that's been shot up once before would have some pretty hardcore security measures in place over there? That's just, it's pretty bizarre that the same place got shot up again, isn't it?
Yeah, probably. And I haven't looked into the background of the story, but there's a lead for...
I haven't either. I didn't even know anything about it. So, like I said, I was in the dark all last night. I just saw it on the front page of the paper this morning, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Another shooting at Fort Hood? How is that even possible?
It says Fort Hood shooter was an Iraq vet being treated for mental health issues, which is about 50% of the people coming back from Iraq, and the suicide rates of Iraqi soldiers is absolutely gone through the roof. So, but yeah, there's probably another underlying story here. Of course, they want to take everybody's guns and rights and freedom away. So, lots of lame stories like this are very important. All right, Dave. Thank you so much.
Sir. Well, very nice talking to you again. And yeah, we should do it again soon.
Let's do that, and let's plan on getting together soon too.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.